Why does Russia keep returning to the same political outcome? Different centuries, different ideologies, different flags, sometimes even different words for the ruler. But the destination keeps repeating. One man at the top, an authoritarian state, and a society arranged around fear, favors, and obedience. And I want to be very clear from the start. This is not about the mystical Russian character, not about religion, not about Russians being uniquely obedient, uniquely cruel, or uniquely incapable of freedom. It's something more practical and, in a way, more unsettling. Russia doesn't just get a dictator. It builds a structure that makes dictatorship the easiest solution to the same recurring problems: distance, insecurity, weak institutions, elite competition, and a constant fight over resources. Once that structure forms, it starts reproducing itself. Even if you change the leader, even if you write a constitution, even if you hold elections, the system keeps drifting back to the same shape because the incentives reward it. My name is Elvira Bary. I'm a writer born in the USSR. And today, I want to take you inside that structure, not as a moral lecture, but as mechanics. The kind of mechanics that explain why Russia can imitate democracy and still end up with a Tsar. Now, to understand why democracy struggles to take root in Russia, we have to ask a very practical question. How is it even possible for one person to seize absolute power in a gigantic country filled with millions of people, each with their own interests, their own ambitions, and their own fears? It sounds almost impossible, especially when the ruler is far away, sometimes thousands of miles away. How do you make people obey one will when that will is distant, abstract, and in a daily life you don't even see it? For this to work, several key conditions must line up. And once they do, the system begins to reproduce itself almost automatically. First condition: dictatorship survives only where the dictator controls big resources. This is the most basic rule. Power is expensive. You need something valuable that can be accumulated into wealth. Because wealth buys loyalty. Wealth pays soldiers. Wealth funds police, prisons, informants, and paperwork. Wealth gives you the ability to buy and produce modern weapons. And modern weapons are, in the end, the final argument of any regime. If there's no wealth, you cannot build a durable empire. You can bully a village, you can terrorize a town, but you cannot hold a territory stretched from Finland to China. Look at history. Egypt had wheat, China had rice, Spain had the silver extracted from the Americas. Every long-lasting imperial machine had a core resource. Russia had several, depending on the era. In medieval Europe, one surprisingly critical resource was wax, not as a luxury, but as a necessity for church rituals. Add to that fur, which wasn't just warm, it was status. Later, Russia's wealth shifted to timber and shipbuilding materials at exactly the moment when Europe began to conquer the oceans. Then wheat became vital during industrialization, when masses of former peasants flooded into cities and needed to be fed. And in the second half of the 20th century, the resource became oil and gas, the most convenient kind of wealth imaginable, because it can be extracted, sold, and converted into money without giving citizens real influence over the state. But even a rich resource does not automatically create an empire, because the second condition is people. No dictator can hold wealth without manpower. A region can be full of gold and diamonds, but if it lacks population, it cannot become an imperial core. Yakutia has immense resources, yet it did not become an empire because it does not have the demographic weight to build one. Russia did. For much of its history, Russia had one of the largest populations in Europe. That meant soldiers, that meant labor, that meant bodies to move grain, build roads, cut forests, staff bureaucracies, and, when necessary, die in wars. How did Russia gain so many people? Part of the answer is grimly accidental. Most people lived in remote villages, far from major trade routes, often barely connected to the outside world. That isolation kept them brutally poor. But it also shielded many communities from the epidemics that repeatedly devastated medieval Europe. Another piece is that after the Mongol invasion, there were comparatively fewer internal wars across much of the European part of Russia than in Western Europe, where feudal conflict was constant. And foreign armies could not easily occupy countless scattered villages in forests with no roads. You could reach many places only by river. Conflicts concentrated around cities, of which there were far fewer than in Europe, while the peasantry was dragged into violence only when armies passed through or when famine triggered mass uprisings. So now we have wealth and we have people. But a third condition is what I call a bottleneck economy. Central power must control access to the resource. Ordinary people, and even elites below the very top, must not be able to use that resource independently. In Russia, for centuries, peasants, merchants, and even nobles could not freely trade with the outside world. The state controlled the narrow passages through which wealth could flow. There were few roads, and those roads were easy to monitor. There were no meaningful seaports at the beginning. The bottleneck formed naturally, and the Tsar turned it into policy. Foreign merchants were welcomed but kept separate. Contact with foreigners was restricted. Trade was channeled through the state. External commerce became, in practice, a royal monopoly. And here is what follows from this. If the ruler controls the bottleneck, the ruler controls the money. If the ruler controls the money, the ruler pays the army. If the ruler pays the army, the ruler has the best weapons. And if you have the best weapons, you can do the simplest thing that creates political reality. You can kill those who refuse to recognize your authority. That is how absolute power becomes physically enforceable across distance. Once these conditions exist, a psychological shift happens. The ruler begins to see the state as property, not as a public institution, not as a temporary responsibility, as property, as something that belongs to him. And then the logic of governance transforms. Local power is given not to those with competence, not to those elected by citizens, not to those who represent communities, but to those who have a personal relationship with the ruler, those he trusts, those who are loyal, those who feel they owe everything to him. Politics becomes a struggle not for policy, but for access to the Tsar and his favor. Courtiers are completely dependent on the ruler's goodwill. And when they receive their share of the resource, they build their own miniature verticals of power using the same recipe. Their resource is not foreign trade. Their resource is proximity. The source of their followers is proximity to them. The chain continues. A clan around a favorite, a clan around the favorite's assistant, around the assistant's secretary, around the secretary's cousin, around whoever happens to hold the key to the corridor. In such a system, the law is not designed to protect everyone equally. It is designed to punish the inconvenient. And when there is no reliable legal protection, there is only one way to be safe. Find a patron. Become part of the system. Or, at minimum, do not quarrel with it. There's where the sacred aura of the Tsar is born. If one person's will can solve any problem, can erase your debt, reverse your sentence, grant your permit, spare your son, approve your business, then that person becomes to you a force of nature. And a force of nature is not something you criticize. It is something you try to appease in a religious sense, because the same will can destroy you instantly, for no reason you can predict. Not always because the ruler personally hates you. Sometimes because you are collateral damage in someone else's fight for access. Now, here is the dark irony. When all hopes concentrate on one person, it becomes an enormous emotional and moral burden. The Tsar has no exit strategy. He cannot simply retire. He cannot be a normal former leader. Leaving power becomes dangerous because power is the only thing that guarantees safety. And if the Tsar refuses to play this game, or plays it in a way that disappoints those who expect favors, the story often ends tragically, not only for him, but for everyone around him. So how does the ruler manage the competing ambitions of elites? Historically, there has been one reliable tool: the secret services. Their original purpose was not to spy on every drunk peasant who spits at the portrait. Their purpose was to keep the aristocracy under control, to prevent powerful families from becoming independent centers of power. The repression below, the constant pressure on ordinary people, is the echo of the structure above. When a system is built as a vertical chain of fear and favors, it reproduces itself at every level. But for this machine to work smoothly, society must be divided into castes. Before the Bolshevik Revolution, caste divisions were official. Only nobles could hold certain positions. Only nobles could truly influence state decisions. Everyone else could only petition, beg, and hope for mercy. In the Soviet Union, the caste system survived unofficially. The old aristocracy was destroyed, but a new upper caste formed. Party officials and managers who controlled access to the resources coming from above. Your status depended not on your competence, but on your place in the hierarchy. Why are castes so important? Because it is terrifying to fall. If you belong to the upper caste, losing your position means losing not just money, but safety, respect, future, and even freedom. That fear turns the upper caste into a loyal support base of the regime. They may hate the ruler privately, but they hate the idea of losing their access even more. And yes, by modern standards, this is a shocking anachronism. It looks medieval. It looks absurd in the 21st century. That is why the ruling class tries to camouflage it. They imitate democracy, they hold elections, but do not allow candidates who are not part of the approved clans. They create a parliament, but fill it with deputies who represent no real voters, only their networks. They write a constitution, but treat it as decoration. They manipulate statistics. They manufacture consent. And the president acts as if endless rule is simply the will of the people. In this system, the dream of an ordinary person becomes very small. Happiness is not justice. Happiness is being left alone, to be allowed to live, to work, to raise children, to bribe the state when necessary, and in exchange, to have the state not crawl into your private life. Russian peasants lived like this for centuries. Pay your dues, perform the required rituals, do not argue, do not attract attention, and the distant landlord, living far away in the capital, forgets you exist. Now think about what this creates psychologically across generations. People learn that politics is not a tool to improve life. Politics is a storm. Politics is danger. Politics is punishment. Politics is something you endure by staying invisible. And to keep the system from changing, to ensure that those in the upper caste do not lose access to the resource, the regime must shape the population in very specific ways. It must isolate people from the outside world. It must prevent basic political education. It must cultivate belief in national greatness and in the greatness of the ruler. And it must plant a deep fear of the new and the unknown, because fear is the most useful fuel a ruler can have. A frightened person accepts almost anything and clings to familiar symbols. A frightened person can be sent to a war that directly contradicts his interests and still be convinced that this sacrifice is necessary. So when you ask, why does Russia always end up with a Tsar? The answer is not a single cultural trait. It is a system built on concentrated resources, demographic mass, controlled bottlenecks, personal patronage, weaponized law, elite castes, secret services, and a population trained to believe that the best possible life is quiet, invisible, and untouched by power. Now, I want to ask you a question. In your country, what is the strongest anti-Tsar mechanism? Is it courts that actually bite? Independent media? Strong local government? Term limits that can be rewritten? A professional civil service? A culture that punishes corruption? And on the flip side, what is the weakest link? The one thing that, if it broke, could let power concentrate too far. Tell me your country and your answer in the comments. I read them, and I often use your insights to shape future episodes. If this kind of deep, system-level analysis is useful to you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still thinks dictatorships happen only because of bad people. And if you want to support the channel and keep it independent, you can use Super Things, buy me a coffee, or PayPal. All links are in the description. Thank you for watching.